Purdue might not have the big man Zach Edey anymore, but they've got a big non-conference slate.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey there, what's up? Happy Thursday to you. Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there. I'm your host today, Isaac Shade, and you're joining me at the place to get your college basketball content every single day. Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for making us your first listen or watch. I want to remind you that you can get every episode ad-free on Amazon Music. Special shout out to all of you everydayers out there and all the members of the Locked On College Basketball Discord. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now in the summer, the sports stop sportsing like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Coming up on the show today, we're taking a look at a couple non-conference schedules which have been recently released. Purdue dropped theirs on Tuesday, just a couple of days ago. Kentucky dropped theirs last week, but we're going to talk about it today. And then also, poor Florida State, man, just the kind of orphan out here. Nobody seems to want them, apparently. We're going to talk about all of that today. But let's start with Purdue, the reigning national runners-up who lose Zach Edey but get back Braden Smith, Fletcher Loyer, Trey Kaufman-Wren. They do lose Mason Gillis to Duke. But, man, I'd tell you what, folks, Matt Painter has loaded up a fun non-conference schedule. Let's talk about it. Let's get into it. I'll run you through it really quick. Big Ten has 20 games, so you get 11 non-conference games for a total of 31 regular season. It starts, as most teams will, on Monday, November 4th at home against Texas A&M Corpus Christi. Then that Friday, November 8th, Purdue will host Northern Kentucky. Monday, 11/11, Purdue will host Yale. Then that Friday, the 15th, they will host Alabama. That is a fun one. Can't wait for that. The next Tuesday, November 19th, Purdue will go to Marquette. And then that Saturday, November 23rd, they will host Marshall. And then Thursday, November 28th and Friday, November 29th, they will be at the Rady Children's Invitational. And that will be them, BYU, Ole Miss, and NC State. That's a fun little quad right there. And then coming out of that, again, that's Friday, November 29th. Then all the way, did you hear me? November 29th. And then not again on the non-conference schedule until Saturday, December 14th. Yeah, that's a big old gap. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But that game is against Texas A&M in the Indy Classic, so a neutral site. And then the next Saturday, December 21st, against Auburn down in Birmingham. That's another neutral site. And then wrapping up the non-con on Sunday, December 29th, against Toledo at home. So several gaps there late in the schedule. So let's get into some takeaways and thoughts on this. Right out of the gate, I like what Matt Painter's doing here. You would think, oh man, we lost Zach Edey. And so now we're gonna kind of temper things down. Hey, look, Purdue has 11 non-conference games. You just heard me say it. Six of those 11 are against high major opponents. That's pretty wild. 3 of which are SEC opponents, maybe 4, because Alabama, Texas A&M, Auburn are guaranteed games. And then in the Children's Invitational, they might play Ole Miss. So that would be 4 SEC teams out of 6 total against major conference opponents. The other two or 3 being Marquette and then either BYU or NC State in the 2 Children's Invitational games there, just depending on how that all breaks down. So look, Matt Painter's saying, hey, we're getting after it. We're still going to do it. And as part of that, another takeaway from this that I really like is that Matt Painter is scheduling these true away games. Now, they're not playing There's only one true away game on this schedule, but it's a voluntary one at Marquette. But part of that is that there's others in the schedule that are going to be true away games in a future year. So as part of that, let me get to what I think are the 5 toughest games in this non-conference schedule. Number 1, at Marquette. Going to Shaka Smart. I know they've lost several guys. You lose Oso Gadaro. You lose Tyler Kolek. But still, Marquette's got some guys, and they're going to be ready to go. So that's a tough game at Marquette. But this one is the first of a home and home. And then the return game will be next year at Purdue. Second toughest game in the non-con to me is hosting Alabama, the second Friday of the season. This also is the first of a home and home with the return game down to Tuscaloosa next year. So I love that scheduling both of these, Marquette and Alabama, true home and homes. I love when teams do this. Let's go to campus. Let's play each other in those environments because it's just good for our sport. So thank you, Shaka Smart. Thank you, Matt Painter. Thank you, Nate Oates. Way to go, fellas. And then the third toughest game on the schedule to me is against Auburn down in Birmingham. It's a neutral site game, but I mean, it's essentially a road game there for Purdue. This home and home was just not home and home, but close to home and home was just finalized this week, earlier this week. And this is the first of a 2-year neutral site game. So this game is down in Birmingham this year against Auburn. And then next year, it'll be the Indy Classic game. So it'll be up in Indianapolis. Really, really fun. And then the 4th and 5th toughest games will be whoever it is in the Rady Children's Classic Invitational. Again, some combination of 2 of the 3 of BYU, Ole Miss, and NC State. I know NC State's coming off that Final Four run. They probably won't be as good this year, but I mean, it's the same thing. You wouldn't have thought they were all that great until the run that they went on. BYU, I'm curious to see what they are in their first year under a new coach, but I like the pieces they're bringing in. And then you know that Chris Beard's doing things at Ole Miss. So look, no throwaway games there. Now, I mentioned there's this big gap you've got on the back end of this non-conference schedule, 2 weeks and a day from the last Children's Invitational game until the Indy Classic game against Texas A&M. That's a massive gap. But last year, there was a very similar gap that went from Tuesday, November 28th until Saturday, December 9th, and there were 2 Big Ten games in there where they played, Purdue played Northwestern and Iowa. Remember, famously, they lost that game, Northwestern, in overtime. I remember exactly where I was watching that one. But so we expect in that gap that there should be at least 2 Big Ten games, maybe 3, because this is a bigger gap than last year's was. But what's interesting is right after that gap, then you got a week off until you play Auburn, and then a week and a day off until you play Toledo. So I wouldn't be surprised when we get the Big Ten schedule if there's some Big Ten games wedged right on in there. Final thing I just want to hit on is to remind you, we do already know the conference opponents for Purdue. We just don't know the order, day, time, all of that stuff, TV. But we know this much. Home and away teams that Purdue will play both at home and away are Indiana, duh. Michigan, love that. I'm excited. I'm really intrigued to see this Michigan team. And then Rutgers. So those will be 6 of the 20 games. Home-only games. These are teams that Purdue will play at Mackey. Maryland, Nebraska, Northwestern, Ohio State, both of the new LA schools, UCLA and USC, and Wisconsin. I wouldn't be surprised if we get some partner scheduling there where UCLA and USC will come out, play probably, I would guess Purdue and Indiana, just keep it in the state of Indiana there. And then the away only games are at Illinois, at Iowa, at Michigan State, at Minnesota, at Oregon, at Penn State, and at Washington. So there you see that again. They will go to play both Oregon and Washington. So I wouldn't be surprised if both of those games are in one swing. And it's kind of like Purdue, maybe in Indiana, will be travel partners. That's what the Pac-12 had done for so long. So we'll keep our eyes on that. But there's the conference schedule for Purdue as well. If I had to give you, let me do a record prediction here for the non-conference game. They're going to win, should win. I mean, Yale. That's probably the toughest of the power conference schools that Purdue will play. They should still win that game. It's at home. So A&M Corpus Christi win, Northern Kentucky win, Yale win. So that's 3-0 right out of the gate. Then you got Alabama at home, Marquette away. I'm going to say they'll go 1-1 in those games. So give me 4-1 at that point. Marshall at home should win that. Rady Children's Invitational, let's split those as well. So that'll get us up to what, 5-1, 6-1 there. And then Texas A&M neutral in Indy, Auburn neutral in Birmingham, and then Toledo. So I'm going to say that Purdue's going to lose 3 non-conference games, go 8-3 in non-conference play. All right, man, I love doing this. I love going through these schedules, looking at kind of the takes and the nuances and all that. And guess what? We're about to do the exact same thing for Big Blue Nation. All right, Kentucky fans, stay with me. We're getting to your non-conference schedule next. Right after I tell you about FanDuel. Man, I love sports so much, and I never want them to stop. But as we get into the summer, we get fewer games, and the sports just aren't sportsing like we want them to. But guess what? FanDuel lets you keep the sports going whenever you want. All you got to do is open up the app and dream up bets anytime you're in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. How about let me give you some odds for the NL MVP as we get into the post-All-Star break portion of the MLB season. Shohei Ohtani leads the way at minus 380. Hard to believe he's doing that just as a batter. Unreal. Bryce Harper plus 410 for the Phillies, and then a precipitous drop-off after those guys. Freddie Freeman of the Dodgers, Marcell Ozuna of the Braves tied for third at plus 2,500. Wow. And then Francisco Lindor from the Mets rounds out the top 5 at plus 3,900. So pretty all in on Ohtani or Harper bringing this thing home. But if you think somebody else could rise up, I mean, you got a big chance to bring home a big chunk of money. And if you want to do that, head on over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. We just talked Purdue's non-conference schedule. Now we're going to get to Kentucky's, which was actually released a week ago today on July 11th. Let's dive right into this thing. We had 11 games for Purdue because the Big Ten has 20 conference games. The SEC is the only one of the Power 4 conferences that is sticking at 18. So you'll hear me read off 13 games here for Kentucky. Let's dive right in. Yes, Monday, November 4th, just like everyone else, they will host Wright State. Saturday, November 9th versus Bucknell. That's at home at Rupp as well. And then the Big Daddy, the one we all love and wait for, Tuesday, November 12th. Kentucky will play Duke in the Champions Classic. Obviously, that's a neutral site game. Man, I cannot wait for it. But does it lose its luster a little bit without Coach Cal? I don't know. I'm trying to decide. It's just like the star power of it. I think the games are going to be fun, but the spectacle of it maybe feels a little bit different to me. Anyway, next game, a week later, you get a week off after Champions Classic there. Tuesday, November 19th, Kentucky hosts Lipscomb. This is part of the Big Blue Nation Invitational. That'll be at Rupp Arena. And then that Friday, November 22nd versus Jackson State as part of the BBN Invitational at home at Rupp. And then the next Tuesday, November 26th against Western Kentucky to wrap up the BBN Invitational also at Rupp. And then that Friday, November 29th versus Georgia State at Rupp. And then we get our SEC ACC Challenge game. This will be Kentucky's lone away game, true road game of the non-conference schedule at Clemson. That should be a really intriguing game. I'm looking forward to that one. That's on Tuesday, December 3rd. Remember, those games are Tuesday and Wednesday of that week. And then that coming Saturday, this is the next game I'm really jazzed about in Kentucky's schedule. They are playing on Saturday, December 7th versus Gonzaga, neutral site game up in Seattle. Should be a blast there. I think that Gonzaga team, by the way, is really underrated nationally. I don't know why, but it just feels like people aren't talking about Gonzaga. They should be. Next, coming home Wednesday, December 11th against Colgate. Then the Bluegrass rivalry we're all waiting for there, Saturday, December 14th against Louisville. That one's at Rupp this year. the next Saturday, get a week off, probably with the exam break here for Kentucky. Saturday, December 21st against Ohio State in the CBS Sports Classic. That's going to be up in Madison Square Garden, the world's most famous arena this year. So Kentucky, Ohio State, that means it'll be North Carolina and UCLA in the other game. And then wrapping up the non-conference schedule, Kentucky will do 10 days later on December 31st, New Year's Eve, against Brown at home. So there you have it, Kentucky's 13-game non-conference schedule. And then 18 SEC games, by the way, keep that in mind. Let me just hit on a soapbox. I hit on it when this was scheduled, and I still feel this way. I love Kentucky and Gonzaga playing this 6-game schedule. But what I don't love is that John Calipari, in my opinion, kind of big time to Mark Few, and we get 2 true home games for Kentucky, 2 games in Rupp, but only 1 true road game for Gonzaga at the Kennel. And I don't like that. So the first game was at Spokane Arena, so close-ish to Gonzaga, but not at Gonzaga. Then at Rupp last year. This year's at Seattle. Next year, I like this one at Nashville. It's still kind of Kentucky stomping grounds, but just it's great. I'm imagining that game will probably be at Bridgestone Arena, which is where the SEC tournament usually is. So a lot of fun there. And then the year after that, back at Rupp, and then closing out the whole thing at the Kennel. So there's that. Something I don't, with Kentucky doing the BBN Invitational, there's no like big time neutral site MTE, and I wish Kentucky had that. I don't like that, but that's all right. It just means it's fewer high major opponents. We talked about Purdue having 6 high major opponents in 11 games. Kentucky only has 4 in 13 games. That would be Duke in the Champions Classic. That would be Clemson in the SEC ACC Challenge. And no, I misspoke there. 5. Clemson. No, I'm right. Duke, Clemson, Louisville, and Ohio State. Those are your 4. And then Gonzaga is not a Power 4 conference school, but they might as well be in terms of how good they are. So you could kind of call it 5 high major opponents for Kentucky in the non-conference schedule. But clearly it's fewer than Purdue. But at the same time, I get it, right? You've got brand new coach coming in, Mark Pope, literally brand new roster, and you don't really know what you're going to have. And so you don't want to put these young men in a situation where they're going to get demoralized if things aren't going well. So I understand this kind of scheduling for this year. And then, for example, the only one true road game is dictated by the ACC SEC Challenge. It'll be at Clemson. Everything else of the 13 non-con games, 9 of them are at Rupp, 3 neutral sites. Those neutral sites being Champions Classic, the CBS Sports Classic game, and the game against Gonzaga in Seattle. And then that 1 true away game at Clemson. So there you have that. Conference opponents, we also get this for the SEC, same as we talked about with the Big Ten. Home and away, Bama and Tennessee. So that in some ways makes up for only having 4, kind of 5 if you count Gonzaga, high major opponents in the non-con, because you got 4 games against Bama and Tennessee. That's fun. That's tough, but we love it. And then kind of a reprieve because the third home and away opponent is Vandy. So Kentucky's got to take care of business there. Home only games, Arkansas, Auburn, Florida, LSU, South Carolina, and Texas A&M. Road only games, Georgia, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Mizzou, Oklahoma, and Texas. So got to go to both of the new conference opponents. And it's funny, kind of got to go to one of the other former Big 12 schools in Mizzou. But the SEC doing Kentucky, their team, the biggest entity in the SEC, no favors by having to go to both Oklahoma and Texas. But there you have that. All right, let me give you what I think will be the record for Kentucky in this non-conference schedule. 13 games, remember? So Wright State, Bucknell, 2-0 right out of the gate. I think, man, I don't know what to make of Duke because they're very, very talented. I just don't know how all the roster pieces fit together. But I am going to take Duke in that game. So 2-1. And then Kentucky gets Lipscomb, Jackson State, Western Kentucky, Georgia State. I think just should on paper run through all those. So you're 6-1 at that point. Then you got to go to Clemson. I think that's a game that Kentucky's going to drop, make it 6-2. Gonzaga up in Seattle. Again, I think this Gonzaga team is going to be really, really good. So I'm going to have Gonzaga winning that one. And then back home for Colgate in Louisville. Louisville is going to be improved, but Kentucky should take this one. It's at Rupp. I don't see them dropping it. Then against Ohio State in the CBS Sports Classic in Madison Square Garden. That's interesting because Aaron Bradshaw's there, so playing his former team. Coach Diebler's brought in some guys in the transfer portal. Man, that should be a good game, actually. Kentucky and Ohio State. I'm going to have Kentucky winning it, but it's going to be close. And then Brown at home to wrap up the non-conference schedule. So who did I have? Losing to Duke, Clemson, and Gonzaga. That would mean 10-3. I feel like Kentucky probably slips up somewhere else, whether it's Ohio State, maybe one of those bye games. So I'm inclined to say 9-4 instead of 10-3. So maybe I should go over under of 9.5. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that if you're listening to this. All right. So there's Kentucky's non-con, my thoughts on it. Love to get into that. Next, we're going to switch. We've gone Big Ten, SEC, and here's what's funny. Now we're going to go to a team that wants to go to one of those conferences, but it sounds like it ain't going to happen. We'll talk about Florida State in just a second. As conference realignment continues to spin and be all crazy, it's very well known that Florida State and Clemson are the two ACC schools right now that are really trying to do work to get out of the conference. Florida State is just going through the courts, doing all their stuff right now. The prevailing thought has been that if and when Florida State is able to get out of the ACC, get out of this grant of rights, however they're going to do it, that they would either go to the SEC or Big Ten. But apparently, according to a recent report from Action's Brett McMurphy, that ain't likely to happen. And you know why? Because the SEC and the Big Ten don't want them. They don't want the Noles. So, boy, it's a rough go from Florida State, who's been doing all this to try to take care of themselves, but they're coming out looking not great in the eyes of other conferences. Yikes. And so it's almost like you're going to break up with a girlfriend because you want to date this other girl, but the new girl's like, no, I saw how you treated your old girlfriend. I don't want to be with you. You know, does that make sense? It's a great parallel, helpful to me. So FSU wants SEC or the Big Ten, but the Big Ten and the SEC don't want them. So according to this report, again, from Action's Brett McMurphy, this article came out or was updated at least on July 16th. So that was on Tuesday. And in the report, it reads, quote, FSU has shown that it's not a good partner. Look what they did, getting the Attorney General involved, accusing former ACC Commissioner John Swofford of rigging the television rights to help his son, filing a suit to expose ESPN's TV deals, something the other three power leagues are against, by the way, the source said. They're not a good partner. There's no congeniality. No one wants that. Yikes. So Florida State, in doing all this stuff to try to distance themselves from the ACC, has made them unpretty, undesirable to the other two power conferences that they wanted to go to in the SEC in the Big Ten. So there's a couple things here why this isn't going to happen, it sounds like, for Florida State. One, because they're not a good partner, as we just talked about. Two, because there's currently, quote, no appetite for expansion. SEC Media Days for football are going on right now. Commissioner Greg Sankey has reaffirmed this, that basically the SEC is good with their 16 schools. Big Ten is kind of saying the same thing. And then a third reason, and this is Big Ten specific, you might or might not be aware that this is a thing, but in the Big Ten, the schools are all AAU member schools, which stands for the Association of American Universities. Now, people will say to you, well, what about Nebraska? They're not. They were when they got into the Big Ten, but they're not anymore. Well, as you would imagine, I'm saying this because Florida State is not part of that AAU. And so that would, and it's not a necessity, but it's what it's always been with the Big Ten. And so that would rule out at least the Big Ten. That's always been a thing to me and to many others, but it's a big part of this conversation as well. So again, another quote specifically from McMurphy's report, quote, Florida State likely will not have a spot in the Big Ten or SEC if it's successful in leaving the ACC. And here's the big important thing, and is why I want to read this quote. If it's successful in leaving the ACC and the ACC stays intact, end quote. So the critical phrase there to me is, and the ACC stays intact. Why? Because McMurphy's only saying if Florida State's able to get out while the ACC is still an entity, which it could not implode. It could not Pac-12ify, right? It could continue to thrive. And if so, that's what we're talking about here. If, however, the ACC does implode, we'd be having a different conversation. Because at that point, if the ACC is gone, it's going to be an arms race to see who can snatch up the most desirable entities from the ACC. But here's the issue for Florida State. If the ACC does implode, it continues to sound like North Carolina and Virginia are kind of first up. And I know that Florida State and Clemson would scoff at that from the football standpoint, but it's bigger than just that in terms of all sorts of things. So, for example, for the SEC and the Big Ten, they'd love to get into the state of North Carolina. They'd love to get into the state of Virginia. They're not right now, right? Like, you keep those things in mind. So all of this means if Florida State and potentially Clemson do get out while the ACC still exists, where are they going to go? It sounds like it ain't going to be the SEC or Big Ten, and that leaves the Big 12. But now the shoe's on the other foot, because the thing there is that Florida State is kind of like, oh, we don't want to go to the Big 12. They kind of turn their nose up at that. Now they're getting uppity. But I'm going to tell you what, folks, if the ACC falls apart, suddenly that Big 12 is going to be looking a lot better if they can't get into the SEC or Big 10, right? So we'll just keep our eyes on all this. But here's the other thing. Big 12 Commissioner Brett Yormark has also said they're pretty content with where they're at right now with their allotment of teams. So I don't know. If I'm Florida State, at some point I say, I wonder if we could just go back to the ACC and get this all figured out. Hey, and I know we said some words, but come on, let's get together. I don't know. We'll see. It's an interesting saga, and it makes for fun content for a podcast. I'll tell you that right now. All right, gang, thanks so much for joining me today. If you haven't subscribed to the show on video and audio, please do so. We'd love to have you. In that way, you ensure that you don't miss a single minute of Locked On College Basketball. If you're not part of the Locked On College Basketball Discord, we'd love to have you in there. Come for the college basketball, man. Stay for that community that's going on. It's so much fun. As always, apologies to the Loyer family. Appropriate today as we talk Purdue. Let's go Wildcats. Appropriate today as we talk Kentucky. How funny is that? We'll talk again tomorrow, but until then, peace.